Well, yesterday we began looking at Paul's injunction for fathers not to embitter their children. I paralleled that with Ephesians 6:4, where he says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children." And the two things that he said would happen if we do that with our kids is, number one, we'll discourage them. You know, kids who only hear no all the time will become discouraged. They'll really kind of just give up. They'll eventually lose their drive. And the worst thing you can do is break the spirit of a child by being over domineering, over controlling, not being gentle and supportive, and not giving them a chance to learn. You know, it's like anything else. From the first time they learn to crawl or they learn to walk, you know, all the cheering and rejoicing that we have, the first time they eat their whole plate, you know, or don't throw it on their head or on the floor. They need to be applauded for those things because they want to be affirmed in the right things. And they also need to be corrected when they're going and doing the wrong things and won't stop doing the wrong thing. I don't believe, as someone once told me, that you should immediately discipline your child every time they do something wrong, because I think that we need to be reasonable with our kids. And some people say, well, you can't reason with a toddler. Yes, but you can display patience with them, and you can seek to reason with them, because one day that will make sense for them. One day it'll click in their brains. But once you've tried to reason with them and they continue to persist in a rebellious behavior, then, you know, a gentle swat in the bottom many times gives them a real significant behavior correction. And they begin to realize that when you say no, you mean it. And when you reason with them, they probably should listen or try to understand what you're saying more clearly. Parenting is not just a one-off thing. We just don't do something and then we're done. It is something that requires everything of us. And I think, quite frankly, the reason many people are choosing not to have kids these days is because they don't want the responsibility of parenting. They don't want, and it's hard work. It is, let me say very honestly, probably the most important thing that you'll do in your entire life. And you will use the things that you learned in parenting throughout the remainder of your life. But Paul, I'll focus on the idea of not doing the negative thing of discouraging your kid. But in Ephesians, he also brings in the positive, what we should be doing as parenting. And he says, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Now, any parent who's tried to have devotional time with his family knows that that is more challenging than you can imagine. My pastor, Pastor Chuck Smith, used to say that he had people come to him and say, "Pastor, I want to be a Bible teacher." And he says, "Well, then if you want to, you need to learn how to teach the Bible. So go volunteer for children's ministry." And he said, if you can learn how to communicate the truths of the Bible to children, you will develop the essential skills to communicating Bible truths to adults. Because in the end, they're pretty much the same. And I remember the first time I heard him say that, I thought to myself, wow, there is no audience that is harder to talk to than kids. Because you have to bring yourself down to their level. And the point is that I've learned in teaching the Bible, and I don't think that anybody would criticize me for being too infantile or too juvenile or too immature in my teaching. I think I try to set a pretty high bar, but at the same time I always ask myself the question as I'm trying to work through a concept that I want to share. Number one, why does it matter to me? Why is it going to matter to them? And how can I say it in a way that makes the most sense and is most understandable? And thirdly, how can they apply this to their life? That's kind of the grid I try to work through as I'm in my mind working through a passage, much like I'm doing here. And I'd say that, so we say to you, you need to train up your kids in the instruction of the Lord. Okay, what does that mean? I know what I tried. I tried having Bible studies with my kids. That didn't work. I found that with small kids, you have to include them in what you're doing. And you have to be patient, and you have to do things that are age appropriate. And if you have an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old, you can't expect the 2-year-old to sit still and behave him or herself the same way you might with an 8 or a 10-year-old. But I find also that as you begin to include them in the process, now what we try to do is to read the Bible to our kids when they're little. And I read books to my kids when they go to bed. I would take the Chronicles of Narnia were our favorite, When they were little, we had a little tiny kids Bible that we'd read to them every night. And that was the beginning to introduce them to biblical concepts. But I say that even though we really knew the importance of the church and Sunday school, even my youngest went to a Christian school, and so did a couple of my older ones for a while, I really found out that they don't really get the idea of living Christianity in your everyday life from any place but in your home. So that when you start by sitting down with them every night as you're putting them to bed and you're reading them, a children's Bible, and as you get older, you buy them their own Bible in a translation, something like the New Living Translation or something that's very easy to read. And then you begin to read them great Christian literature. Pilgrim's Progress, Chronicles of Narnia, these kind of books that I enjoyed reading because Lewis was great. The Lord of the Rings and these other things, great pieces of Christian literature that as you read these things and you can begin to explain to them, do you see Christ in this? Do you see the Christian life and the parallels that we live in? That became very, very important, not only in their intellectual formation, but even the idea that certain truths and concepts began to become definitive in their life. Because what I see tragically in our culture today is a generation of kids who grow up with no ballast in their ships. There's no anchor. There's no rudder to where they're going. They go out in the world, pull up the sail, and the wind just drives them wherever they want to go. And then they wonder, why is my life so stormy and chaotic and disorganized and troubled? And that's where somebody comes along saying, it's because you have these identity issues. And now we have 3 million different identities that you can try on. And there will be no end to the uniforms that you can put on in an effort to try to find out who the real you is, until we can never know who we are until we know Jesus, our personal Lord and Savior. But you see, what's the problem right now, I think, with many parents is we neglect our kids. We say things like, well, I want my kids to have quality time, not just quantity of time. And I would challenge you by saying, how do you distinguish between the two? When I've had surgery, and I've had 3 or 4 surgeries in my day, you know what I've done? I've gone out and I've researched and asked people who are the best surgeons with this that deal with this kind of problem that I have. I mean, I want to know how many surgeries they've done, how successful they've been. I want to get the best. I want people who have spent a quantity of time learning their skill, learning their craft, being as good as they can be, that I don't want them opening up and going, gee whiz, I've never seen this before. I don't want to be that guy. I want the guy saying, I've been here before. I know how to handle this. That's because he put a quantity of time to develop a quantity of ability. And that's important. We need to understand that our kids need our time. We need to give them a quality time. They need to feel us touching them. And some of you struggle with affection, but you need to touch your kids. You need to show them physical affection. They need to be hugged. They need to be kissed on the neck and the forehead. You need to, and you need to let them know that, because kissing is one of the most intimate actions we engage in. When we kiss somebody, if you kiss somebody that you hate, then you've got deeper problems. But we kiss people who we love. And the absence of kissing is signs in a marriage that something's a problem. The absence of kissing of our kids is a sign of something missing as well. And you understand, I'm not talking about passionate romantic kisses, but that's why the Bible says, greet one another with a holy kiss, because it was an indication that you loved that person. We need to be patient with them and realizing that it took us a long time to figure out which way things worked. And we need to understand their unique bent, their unique personality. I remember a guy who I knew who was dyslexic, and nobody recognized he was dyslexic. Everybody just thought he was dumb because he couldn't read. And yet, when I came to know him, I realized he's a really, really quite bright, intelligent guy. He just doesn't learn the way I learn. And many times parents, because they want their kids to fit into a box that they think is a Christian child, they really can be really hard on them. And with that neglect comes a lot of criticism, because neglectful parents tend to get irritated when their kids don't conform to what they expect of them, not seeing their own culpability and failing to train them, spend time with them, guide them. Because ultimately, think about this, your children, more than anybody else, want your approval. more than anything else in their life. They want your approval. And if they can't get it in a positive way, they will act out in a negative way because they just want to be noticed if they can't be loved. But they do not want to be forgotten. And so criticism basically is always pointing out what's missing, what's lacking. There's no appreciation, no praise. We've talked about that. But also anger becomes a projection of your own frustrations and failures, that when you find yourself becoming really angry over something that your kid does, you need to step back and ask yourself, what am I really angry about? And see, that's what happens. A lot of people, moms and dads, come home angry, frustrated. They've never learned how to constructively communicate their anger or frustration. And so they become passive-aggressive personalities. I find that people who are passive-aggressive personalities in the workplace or in the school come home and let all that aggression out in a not-so-passive way. And so many times we have to understand that if we're coming home and we're frustrated, we're angry, and we're ventilating, we need to realize that our kids or our spouse isn't the problem. The problem is in here, and we need to ask God to help us to overcome that. Well, I'm out of time, overtime. It's just such a heavy set of things we're talking about, such important stuff, and I just pray that God has given you some things that you can work with. Maybe some guidance. And I do have a book on marriage. I have a book on parenting. I encourage couples to sit down and read these together and talk about them. Not just simply pick them up and read them, but read a chapter and have a conversation about what did you get out of that. My marriage book has a question and answer thing. You can use that if you want in the back of it. Not so much with the parenting book. But I think that there are a lot of things we can sit down and just begin to ask ourselves the question, how can we become more effective in leading our children as parents? It's the most important thing you'll do probably in your lifetime. God bless you and go in His grace.